This passage is adapted from a speech delivered by Tom Calmer, Still Riding for Freedom, by the Australian Human Rights Commission. Aboriginal Australians and the Torres Strait Islanders are the indigenous people of Australia. For too long now, we have heard it argued that a focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's rights takes away from a focus on addressing Aboriginal and Islander people's disadvantage. This approach is, in my view, seriously flawed for a number of reasons. It represents a false dichotomy, as if poorer standards of health, lack of access to housing, lower attainment in education, and higher unemployment are not human rights issues, or somehow they don't relate to the cultural circumstances of indigenous peoples. And it also makes it too easy to disguise any causal relationship between the actions of government and any outcomes, and therefore limits the accountability and responsibilities of government. In contrast, human rights give Aboriginal and Islander peoples a means for expressing their legitimate claims to equal goods, services, and most importantly, the protection of the law, and a standard that government is required to measure up to. The focus on practical measures was exemplified by the emphasis the previous federal government placed on the record levels of expenditure annually on Indigenous issues. As I've previously asked, since when did the size of the input become more important than the intended outcomes? The government never explained what the point of the record expenditure argument was or what achievements were made. And the fact is that there has been no simple way of being able to decide whether the progress made through record expenditure has been good enough. So the practical approach to these issues has lacked any accountability whatsoever. If we look back over the past 5 years in particular, we can also see that a practical approach to issues has allowed governments to devise a whole series of policies and programs without engaging with indigenous peoples in any serious manner. I've previously described this as the fundamental flaw of the federal government's efforts over the past 5 years. That is, government policy that is applied to indigenous peoples as passive recipients. Our challenge now is to redefine and understand these issues as human rights issues. We face a major challenge in skilling up government and the bureaucracy so that they are capable of utilizing human rights as a tool for best practice policy development and as an accountability mechanism. In March this year, the Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, Ministers for Health and Indigenous Affairs, every major Indigenous and non-Indigenous peak health body and others signed a statement of intent to close the gap in health inequality, which set out how this commitment would be met. It commits all of these organizations and governments, among other things, to develop a long-term plan of action that is targeted to need, evidence-based, and capable of addressing the existing inequalities in health services in order to achieve equality of health status and life expectancy between Aboriginal and Islander peoples and non-Indigenous Australians by 2030. Ensure the full participation of Aboriginal and Islander peoples and their representative bodies in all aspects of addressing their health needs. Work collectively to systematically address the social determinants that impact on achieving health equality for Aboriginal and Islander peoples. Respect and promote the rights of Aboriginal and Islander peoples, and measure, monitor, and report on our joint efforts in accordance with benchmarks and targets to ensure that we are progressively realizing our shared ambitions. These commitments were made in relation to Indigenous health issues, but they form a template for the type of approach that is needed across all areas of poverty, marginalization, and disadvantage experienced by Indigenous peoples. They provide the basis for the cultural shift necessary in how we conceptualize human rights in this country. Issues of entrenched and ongoing poverty and marginalization of Indigenous peoples are human rights challenges, and we need to lift our expectations of what needs to be done to address these issues and of what constitutes sufficient progress to address these issues in the shortest possible time so that we can realize a vision of an equal society. One central theme of the passage is that expanding legal rights of citizens will not necessarily improve national health outcomes. Human rights initiatives should generally receive more funding than health initiatives do. Human rights should be used as a framework for government policy on indigenous issues. Focusing on indigenous people's rights detracts from the more practical concerns of indigenous communities. Okay, so if you look at the first paragraph here, it says that for too long now, we have heard it argued that a focus on islander people's rights takes away from a focus on addressing their disadvantage. So the idea that we should talk about their disadvantage is considered more important than talking about human rights per se. And the author argues against that by saying that human rights include disadvantage, addressing disadvantage that Aboriginals face, right? So it includes poor health outcomes, it includes poor educational outcomes, and all of that, right? So, yeah, so it's not B because there is no comparison of human rights initiatives with health initiatives. What about A? Expanding legal rights of citizens will not necessarily improve national health outcomes. Focusing on indigenous people's rights detracts from the more practical. No, it's not D either because he says that rights encompass the practical concerns, right? So he's actually arguing against option D because he's saying that they go together. Human rights should be used as a framework for government policy on indigenous issues. And okay, see, for example, this is something that he repeatedly states that human rights give Aboriginal and Islander peoples a means for expressing their legitimate claims to equal goods. Right. So he's saying that the focus on their development, which includes practical concerns as well, concerns related to education, to health, etc., they should come under the template of human rights, right? So human rights should be used as a framework for policy on indigenous issues. According to Kama, the government's failure to link its expenditure on indigenous health initiatives to specific health outcomes is harmful because it reinforces negative attitudes about the government's financial fitness, undermines efforts to standardize practices across all departments of the government, perpetuates the pattern of government officials abusing their authority, allows the government to evade the obligation to be answerable for its policies. So I think it's D, right? Because if you go back and read this part where he says um, that when did the size of the input become more important than the intended outcome? The government never explained what the point of the argument was or what achievements was made. So it has lacked any accountability, right? This has basically, because the government says that we have spent a record amount of money on indigenous issues, that kind of gives them the leeway or the space to evade accountability, which is what D is saying, that it allows the government to evade the obligation to be answerable for its policies. There's nothing to do about government's financial fitness or applying these standards to all departments or government officials abusing their authority. Kama indicates that in the past, the Australian government stressed which aspect of its relationship to Indigenous peoples, the willingness it has shown to meet with Indigenous leaders, the regret it has expressed for the injustices it committed against Indigenous peoples, the improvements it has made in Indigenous peoples' living standards, the financial resources it has devoted to Indigenous issues. So I think it's D again, because if you go back, yeah, for example, the previous federal government placed on the record level of expenditure. So it's very clearly the fact that the government has come up with an idea that we have devoted so much money, that is what the government has said, which obviously Kama says is not enough. So it's not about willingness to meet with Indigenous leaders or the regret it has expressed for injustices done to Indigenous peoples or the improvements made in their living standards. As used in line 30, decide most nearly means And the fact is that there has been no simple way of being able to decide whether the progress made through record expenditure has been good enough. No simple way to decide, to determine, right? There has been no simple way to determine whether this progress has been good enough. Accept, choose, or wonder, they don't fit the context. Based on the passage, Kama would most likely agree that programs related to indigenous issues would have a better chance of succeeding if the Australian government empowered indigenous communities to assist in devising and implementing such programs, funded such programs as generously as it funds programs benefiting non-indigenous people, modeled such programs on healthcare initiatives that have a proven record of success, devoted as many resources to such programs as the previous government did. So it's option A, right? Because he's saying that you cannot implement these programs unless you take help from indigenous communities in developing these programs and in implementing these programs, right? I've previously described this as the fundamental flaw of the federal government's efforts, that is government policy that is applied to indigenous people as passive recipients, right? So they have to be actively involved, and this is evidence pair. So we'll just look at the line numbers 15, 19, 24, 28. 15 to 19, 24 to 28, 38, 41, 75, 79. 38 to 41. So I think it would be this one, and 75 to 79. So it has to be C because we just read these lines which talked about how the government has looked upon indigenous people as passive recipients of government largesse, and that is a flaw of government policy. Option A, in contrast, human rights give Aboriginals and Islander peoples a means of expressing their legitimate claims. Option B, when did the size of the input become more important than the outcome? Option D, these commitments were made in relation to indigenous health issues, but they form a template for types of approaches. So these don't really address this idea that the government needs to actively involve indigenous people. So that's C. Beginning with the 9th paragraph, the focus of the passage shifts from 42 to 88. We face a major challenge in scaling up government. So I think so far the passage has talked about the issues, the problems with the government policy, and then it moves to solutions and what can be done, right? Because it gives you a list of things that can be done. The focus shifts from a description of conditions in indigenous communities to recommendations for improving those conditions. Criticism of the Australian government's past approach to indigenous issues to an outline of its new approach. Condemnation of officials' indifference towards indigenous concerns to a proposal to address those concerns. A discussion of tensions between the Australian government and indigenous groups to a suggestion of how those tensions can be resolved. Okay, so I like D, and I'll tell you why, because why is B wrong? This part is fine, that there is a criticism of the Australian government's approach, but it's not an outline of the government's new approach. These are recommendations that the committee that the author is talking about has made. I think in A, the second part is good. There are recommendations, but I think A is not, the first part is not good because it's not just a description of conditions, but it's basically a criticism of the government and how the government has treated those issues. I don't think he's condemning the officials' indifference towards indigenous concerns, right? Rather, he's saying that there are better ways to address these issues. So D is the best answer, that there have been tensions between the Australian government and indigenous peoples. But is tensions the best word? Because that makes it sound that there's some sort of conflict going on. Yeah, I think D would be better. I know the tensions word is a little odd, but I still think it's the best answer. Yeah. The list in lines 55 to 74 mainly serves to, so that list of pointers, summarize actions specified in the statement of intent, propose modifications to the statement of intent, enumerate similarities between the statement of intent and past agreements, identify certain inconsistencies in the statement of intent. So this is A, right? These are actions that the statement of intent suggests should be taken up so that the plight of indigenous peoples can be ameliorated, can be their situation can be improved. As used in line 72, targets most nearly means measure, monitor, and report on our joint efforts in accordance with benchmarks and targets to ensure that we are realizing our ambitions. So with goals, right? These are the goals that you are planning to reach. So that's the best answer. Based on the passage, Kama regards the audience of his speech as being skeptical that the specific individuals responsible for the government's failed policies on indigenous issues will be held accountable, poorly informed about the economic and social conditions found in most indigenous communities, doubtful of the value of discussing indigenous issues within the larger context of human rights, overly tolerant of the fact that the government initiatives to address inequality faced by indigenous people have not succeeded. Okay, so who is he addressing it to? He is simply delivering a speech. It's not, there's no mention of an audience. So I think C so far looks to be the best answer because he's trying to make an argument to bring the discussion of indigenous issues within the larger context of human rights, right? Within the larger framework of human rights. So I think that is kind of the best answer to me. Let's look at the line numbers once. 42, 43, 44, 47. 42, 43, 44, 47, right? 80, 84, 84, 88. 80, 84, 84, 88. Okay. So our challenge now is to redefine and understand these issues as human rights issues. So definitely this is an important point. We face a major challenge in skilling up government and the bureaucracy so that they are capable of utilizing human rights as a tool for best practice policy development as an accountability mechanism. They provide the basis for the cultural shift necessary in how we conceptualize human rights in this country. Issues of entrenched and ongoing poverty and marginalization are human rights challenges. And we need to lift our expectations of what needs to be done to address these issues and of what constitutes sufficient progress to address these issues in the shortest time frame necessary. Okay, let's look at the options once more. So it's definitely not A because the passage's focus is not on accountability of officials. I don't think he feels that the audience is poorly informed about the conditions. I think the question here is how best to improve those conditions. Yeah, so it is definitely C. Now, between among the options, I think C would be the best answer because even though A talks about redefining and understanding these issues, I think the fact that he's saying that we require a cultural shift in how we conceptualize human rights issues, that's the best evidence for why his audience might be doubtful of looking at these issues as human rights issues, right? Because we are looking at doubtful, right? So C is better.